Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's think about the subject of alternative futures. Then, after we have a grasp, perhaps even on a limited level, of that topic, we can begin relating it to Maoism-Third Worldism and to the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar. The term alternative futures is pretty self-explanatory. There was, up until just a few years ago, an institute for alternative futures. That institute no longer exists. I would say regrettably, because it's always good to put oneself in the driver's seat, to think in terms of possibilities, of how we might imagine the kind of world that we will live in. If we don't do that, then the direction of the world might become haphazard. Or if we attempt to imagine the future, but we are biased, in other words, you're not consulting people with a diversity of viewpoints, then our perspective on the future may be very limited. It's a bit like the Buddhist and Jain parable of the blind men and the elephant. I would assume that you have probably heard of it at one time or another. The idea is, and I'm paraphrasing it at best, you have an elephant and you have a bunch of blind men. One blind man touches the elephant and says, "Oh," holding the tail, "this is a snake." Another one touches the leg of the elephant and says, "Oh, this is a tree trunk." Another one touches the tail of the elephant and says, "Oh, this is a worm." None of them, of course, are right, or maybe all of them are right in a sense, not ontologically, but epistemologically, meaning their perceptions are accurate. From their own perspectives, they are perceiving things correctly, even if ontologically, meaning in terms of the substance of what they are perceiving, they are wrong. I think that is a good way of beginning a discussion on alternative futures. I wish that the Institute for Alternative Futures still existed. I was a member of that institute. I really loved it. They published some really, really good papers. But notwithstanding the end of that institute, many other organizations exist which attempt to explore the concept of alternative futures as well. In a recent podcast, I discussed the concept of futurism, and I explained why I think that futurism is not a very successful field. Why, despite the efforts of futurists to be accepted as scientists and to have futurism accepted as a science, it has failed, and failed miserably. Like, I think I gave one example of that conference I attended, which I believe was sponsored by the World Future Society, in which one of the workshops I was in involved closing your eyes and visualizing the future that you want to see. The person who conducted that workshop said that simply by visualizing the future that you want, you are helping to bring it into being. Now, if that sounds like nonsense to you, imagine imagine how it sounded to people that were thinking about perhaps making futurism into a department at their colleges or universities. That would not have been very impressive. You don't talk about Shakti Gawain's creative visualization. Shakti Gawain, as far as I know, is the person who coined that term, creative visualization, in a book by that name, and expect your field or your ideas to be respected in an academic context. That is simply not going to happen. And so decades have gone by since I attended that conference. I believe it was back in the mid-1970s, maybe late 1970s. And still, you look around the country, the United States, look around the world, and I don't see departments of futurism in colleges and universities. And I would be extraordinarily surprised were that to happen in the future. So, how is futurism different from alternative futures? The difference, as I see it, is that futurism is a field. They publish a journal. They have tried to gain respectability. The problem is that many times, maybe most times, the predictions made by those futurists failed to materialize. On the other hand, alternative futures does not pretend to be a field. Instead, it is an activity. It is a way of trying to imagine what tomorrow may be like. And to me, that is a very, very useful activity, as long as it does not degenerate into a kind of idealistic utopianism of the kind that was condemned by Friedrich Engels in his book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Friedrich Engels was certainly no friend of utopian socialism. But if alternative futures is simply understood as a type of planning, actual planning, not trying to imagine what the future may look like, or not speculating on what the future may look like, but engaging in concrete activity here and now that will help, hopefully, bring about the kind of future that we want, well, that's an entirely different thing. That is not futurism. Both may have the word future in a certain form in it, but they are not the same thing. So although I find futurism to be less than useful, I find alternative futures, if practiced in a sophisticated and intelligent way, to be extraordinarily useful. So that is the groundwork, the definition for alternative futures, and the distinction that I would make between that and futurism. In other words, as I see it, talking about alternative futures is not futurism, because you are not predicting, you are planning. It is a concrete activity. You are looking at the world as it is right now. You are critiquing it and then saying, well, where do we want to be in the future? And what steps, what strategies, what tactics do we need to take to get to that future? So I like alternative futures. I really like alternative futures. Now, let's relate that to the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar first, and then to Maoism-Third Worldism. As I understand Bhaskarian critical realism, it is a methodology for achieving communism. There is no specific type of communism that Roy Bhaskar proposed. My impression, although Roy was very careful not to put himself into any particular category, was that Bhaskar was a Marxist-Leninist. He thought very favorably about both the Soviet Union and of Cuba. But he didn't really care that much about that. He was not a political scientist or a politician. Critical realism was not itself a communist tendency per se, or a communist current. It is a way of approaching reality. So you can think perhaps of critical realism as a philosophy of science and also a moral philosophy. It is a way of approaching science by seeing the objects that we study in science as being real, and as a moral science, recognizing that there is such a thing as moral reality, meaning morality is not relative, morality is real. There is a right and wrong, in other words, in a sense. I don't like that term particularly, right and wrong, but in a sense there is. We can judge things. We can judge the value of things. What Roy did through his various stages or turns, to use the technical language of critical realism, was to establish this particular method. It began with basic critical realism. It then went to dialectical critical realism, which obviously introduced the concept of the dialectic. It then progressed to transcendental dialectical critical realism, which I believe was influenced by Roy's own practice of transcendental meditation, a method of meditation which was promoted by the late Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But in addition, what transcendental dialectical critical realism was a recognition that in order to bring about change that is meaningful, that is enduring, one needs to focus on how we can transcend the present, how we can transcend the present through empirical observation. It was basically an epistemological approach. Transcendental dialectical critical realism was Roy Bhaskar's approach to epistemology, or at least a major part of it. Finally, shortly before Roy died, he came up with this other thing that he referred to as the philosophy of meta-reality. What he said is that the philosophy of meta-reality would be the final turn of critical realism. Now, whether that would have been true, I don't know. And no one can know because Roy died. Sometimes people will say, I have reached the end, and then something new will pop into their heads, and they will begin reconsidering and come up with an addition, or perhaps even come up with an entirely new approach, which might run parallel to the original approach that they had. So again, there's no way of knowing what Roy might have done had he lived longer than 70 years old, which is a shame. He was such a brilliant man, such a fantastic scholar. It was sad that he only lived until the age of 70. But again, that was not something that he had any control over. he had a degenerative disease, and eventually it killed him. The philosophy of meta-reality is a kind of complement to transcendental dialectical critical realism. Some people have incorrectly placed them both in the same category, have said that, well, really just meta-reality is simply a continuation of transcendental dialectical critical realism, right? No, at least not to my understanding, and not to Roy's understanding either. Why? Well, because transcendental dialectical critical realism, that mouthful, was epistemological, whereas the philosophy of meta-reality was ontological. So they certainly need each other. You can't have one without the other. I mean, what's the point of ontology if you can't observe it? What's the point of epistemology if there is nothing to observe? So obviously both are necessary, but they need to be radically distinguished from each other. What Roy also discussed was something that he called the epistemic fallacy. What he meant by that is the tendency of people, especially in the West, and I would argue even more particularly here in the US, to collapse the collective into the individual, or perhaps to use the language of my field, to reduce the sociological to the psychological. Americans seem very much fascinated with psychology, usually pop psychology, not academic psychology. There are all these self-help books, often written by people who may or may not be psychologists, but claim that they have found a method which can help you transform yourself. That's pop psychology. But even regular psychology, when you watch a talk show, it is very common to see a guest on the show who is a psychologist. How common is it to see a guest who is a sociologist? Not that common at all. And I think that is a real deficiency in the way in which Americans in particular view the world. So if I try to reduce the collective, the real, the ontology or the being to my perception of that ontology, real or being, I am engaging in the epistemic fallacy, and that is not a good thing to do. Roy was very critical of that fallacy and saw it as one of the major defects in Western philosophy, going back to Immanuel Kant, but even further back than that. What Roy said is that the philosophy of meta-reality, again, the final turn of Roy's critical realism, is an attempt to understand what does it mean for reality to exist. If I talk about reality, I might be talking about a couple of different things. One, for example, is co-presence. Another is demi-reality. Those are terms that, while not coined by Roy, were used extensively by him. Co-presence is a recognition that everything, people, animals, minerals, vegetables, are all present with one another. That, in effect, everything is connected to everything else. That if I hurt you, I am also hurting myself, because we are one. So if Israel thinks that by destroying Gaza, it will not bring some destruction upon itself, and I don't know how that will happen, but I think that Israel is sorely deluded. And I certainly don't wish that upon anyone. I would like everyone to lead prosperous, healthy lives. But if your desire is to harm another being or other beings, then ultimately you are going to harm yourself as well, because we are all co-present. We are all present with each other. Similarly, for more than a century, we have been polluting the earth, especially the atmosphere. In many parts of the world, people walk around with masks because not to do so would be really, really dangerous. And there are regular reports made of what the quality of air will be on a particular day. And based on that forecast, people will decide whether or whether not to wear a mask. That, for example, is very common in places like Tokyo, where long before COVID hit, it was very common to see people walking down the street wearing masks. Something that people in the West only began to see with the rise of COVID. And now we are seeing it less and less as COVID kind of leaves the popular imagination, whether rightly or wrongly. I know I personally very rarely wear a mask either, so I'm not criticizing other people because I don't do it either, whereas I used to. So if the air is polluted, that pollution has an effect on human beings as well. I guess you could say I'm not a biologist or a geologist, that air is a part of the mineral kingdom. It's a mineral substance, basically. So you have mineral substance, particles floating around in the air that are very dangerous to human beings. And those particles, if they get into the human body, can cause tremendous damage. That is the problem with air pollution. We are, as I speak, as a planet, literally destroying our own habitat, making the earth an unlivable place. Whether that happens, I don't know. But we seem to be on a track toward that end right now. I hope we make another decision. But if we do, we need to make that decision very quickly, because literally the hourglass is running out. We don't have that much more time. So again, co-presence does not only refer to people, which is how most people use it, like I'm co-present with you, or I'm present with you, I have a connection with you. It refers to everything. Everything in the universe, everything throughout all the universes is co-present with everything else. And that is true whether you were talking about physical objects or spiritual objects. That is how Roy explained it. Roy developed the philosophy of meta-reality and his transcendental dialectical critical realism as a part of what he referred to as his spiritual turn, which began around the year 2000, at the time when Roy took a trip to India and met numerous individuals, including gurus, and learned from them and adopted various aspects of various Hindu philosophies. So, again, put those things together. We have a new epistemology, transcendental, dialectical, critical realism, which allows us to look at things spiritually, including through a method that Roy referred to as phenomenological analysis. Certainly, Roy did not originate that, but he advocated it as a type of meditation. And then you have the philosophy of meta-reality, which is not epistemological, but instead is ontological, which allows us to look at things around us and examine them in terms of their substance. Are they co-present, which is the ideal, or are they demi-real? So that brings us into the second major category that I'm going to talk about here of Roy Bhaskar's philosophy of meta-reality. Having talked about co-presence, demi-reality is kind of a letdown, I guess. What Roy said is that the world that we live in right now is dominated by demi-reality. What he meant by demi-reality was, he said, in his words, a translation of the Sanskrit term Maya, which is usually rendered into English as illusion. But he also meant by demi-reality disunity, and occasionally he would use the term splitting, which I referred to in a previous podcast. So we have that choice. That gives us some guidance. If we are looking for an alternative future, we can choose to base that alternative future on co-presence, which is what is needed. Because without co-presence, we will simply destroy ourselves, or on demi-reality, which now dominates the world that we are living in, which is destruction itself. And we see it playing out right now in the war between Israel and Gaza. I only wish that the Israeli regime realized that in waging that war and trying to destroy Gaza, they are also hurting themselves. But Bibi Netanyahu and other people in his government somehow think that they can win, that they can be in a position of superiority after that war. I don't know why they think that. You can't hurt somebody else without simultaneously hurting yourself. Me, I don't want to see anyone get hurt. I want us all to thrive. I do. But the way we look, the way we see the world right now, epistemologically, is not a world that is thriving. It's not a world of co-presence. It is a world of demi-reality. Ultimately, the objective of critical realism, including all the turns that we talked about, is to arrive at communism. And communism in the way that Marx defined it, and going beyond the way that Marx defined it. After all, scientific socialism is not limited to Marx and Engels. It also includes Lenin, it includes Mao, it includes Red Rosa Luxemburg, it includes Fidel Castro, and more. It is a science, and as a science, it can be developed by anyone who is willing to follow its principles, who is willing to conform to a scientific method that is based on scientific socialism. And I believe that there are multiple scientific methods that can be derived from scientific socialism, not just one. Critical realism presents many of them, not just one, but many of them. But I will leave that for another time. Second, Maoism-Third Worldism. Well, if critical realism provides a map or a pathway or a method for arriving at communism or socialism, Maoism-Third Worldism basically says where we want to go. In other words, it recognizes that the world that we are living in today, dominated by the first world, which obviously also impacts the third world, is not desirable. It is simply destroying itself. We are destroying ourselves in the first world. And as a result of that, the third world is not in very good shape either. So Mao's third worldists, like myself, would say that after the first world has expired or given up, or I don't know, somehow when the first world has lost, whatever lost means in your mind, I have no idea. When it has expired, that's probably the best word to use. That the third world can pick up the mantle and continue going on toward the future, toward an alternative future of socialism and communism. Now, that does not necessarily exclude the first world. It may not. If there is still a first world, I see no reason why the first world that remains, the remnant of it anyway, cannot join with the third world in building socialism and communism. Why not? I mean, again, if we are all co-present with one another, as Roy Bhaskar said we are, then we should be willing to throw our petty differences aside and work together for the advancement of the proletariat, for the advancement of humanity. And ultimately, I would hope that the proletariat and humanity will become one and the same. In other words, if there are no more capitalists, if there are no more aristocrats, then all of us will be workers or potential workers or previous workers, potential workers, babies, young children, previous workers like myself, who is retired. But I was a worker for my entire career, obviously, or else I would not have the money I have, which I don't deserve. But regardless, the idea of Maoism Third Worldism gives us some idea of what goal we should try to reach towards. And hopefully, if we play our cards right, we can reach that destination together by working with each other, not by working against each other. Right now, that is precisely what we are doing. We are living in a world of demi-reality. We are literally working against each other. I see that in the US. Democrats versus Republicans. A bill proposed by Republicans on immigration, accepted by Joe Biden, then accepted by Democrats, then rejected by those same Republicans. Why? Because the Democrats had accepted it. That is pure demi-reality. You cannot have a thriving civilization under demi-reality. You can only have a thriving civilization under co-presence. For now, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.